Go. Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Galka, and I'm here as part of the Heart Hub team. And so we are thrilled to welcome you to our February 2022 First Tuesday discussion. Tonight, we're going to be talking about ethics. And in the psychedelic space, ethics has taken on a bit of front page news with work around the School of Consciousness Medicine, most recently and most prominently, but also generally in this space where a lot of this work is not subject to any kind of regulatory body, and it's such a new space. There is definitely an opportunity and a need to discuss ethics in the absence of that set of external controls. And so we're thrilled to have with us tonight Douglas Rusk, who will be presenting our session and having a Q&A with us later on. Douglas is a cis gay man who's been working in the mental health field since 2018. He has trained and worked in residential drug and alcohol treatment over the last 5 years and is certified in psychedelic-assisted therapeutics through the ATMA Academy in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Currently, Douglas is working towards his designations with the Canadian Professional Counselors Association and the Association of Counseling Therapy in Alberta. In 2021, he founded Darkwater Navigations, a mental health collective with a mission to bring barrier-free mental health care to the world through disenfranchising the mental health industrial complex. Douglas's scope of interest includes helping people heal their traumas related to the LGBTQ2 SIA plus life experience, medical trauma, addictions issues, and more. He has a passion for working in the emerging psychedelic renaissance with a focus on ethics and harm reduction. And so thank you very much for joining us, Douglas, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. What a wonderful introduction. Thank you for taking the time to write that for me. I'm just going to pop my screen up here, and we're going to jump into our presentation for today. Where'd we go? Oh, no. Is that coming through okay for you?
Perfect.
Yeah. So I'm Douglas Rusk. I'm from Darkwater Navigations, as Peter said. I'm here to talk about ethics today in the psychedelic spaces. So we're going to talk a little bit about above ground and below ground as we get into things. Before we do that, I just wanted to acknowledge respectfully that I'm privileged to live and work on Amiskatchewaskikan, which is Edmonton. It's in Treaty 6 territory, which is home to many Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Cree, Dene, Saltus, the Blackfoot, the Nakota Sioux, as well as Métis, Inuit, and other nations not represented by the treaty. So just a bit about Darkwater Navigations. We're on a mission to demonetize mental health care. We operate from a core belief that access to mental health supports a basic human right, and we believe that true barrier-free mental health is affected through community and relationships and not by transactions. We believe everybody has a right to a will to live. Just going to bump through to this. So the way that we do that is one human connection at a time. So when you book a session through Darkwaters, every session that's booked donates a session to somebody that's seeking support through community resources. So for right now, that's based in Edmonton, but as we expand our caregiver network, you'll see that expand to other cities as well. So before we dive in, I just have an experiment. If you're willing to do this with me, I'd love you to take a second and look at this photo and just make a mental note, or maybe you feel like writing it down about what this is a picture of, and it'll come back to us at the end of the first part of the presentation. So just give you a second to do that internally or externally. All right, so we're talking about ethics and psychedelic therapeutics. So I did just mention there's above ground and underground versions of this. So the first half of this information is going to come from an above ground perspective, so from a clinical perspective. And then the second half of the information is really applicable to anybody, whether you're an underground practitioner, you're an underground participant, or you're just somebody that plays in psychedelics in a recreational sense. So this is an email I got from the Alberta Counseling Therapists Association. And basically they told me that as long as psychedelics remain illegal in Canada, I am not able to say that I do psychedelic integration or psychedelic harm reduction. So the reason behind that is that right now psychedelics are illegal. So it could be conceived that in saying that I do psychedelic integration work, I'm encouraging my clients to do an illegal activity. And so I am not able to be accredited through the Alberta Counseling Therapists Association, the Alberta College of Psychologists or Psychiatrists, any regulatory body in Canada has this stance in this moment. So if you're not doing something through Section 56, if you're not doing something through the Special Access Program, and if you're not working in a clinical research setting or with ketamine, which is already approved off-label for use in therapeutic settings, you will not be able to get accreditation with one of the associations that exist. So it leaves us to the question, who do we look for when we're navigating ethical guidelines? So there are no current standards that exist specific to psychedelic therapy or psychedelic therapeutics, or even, well, recreational psychedelics are a different thing. From the harm reduction lens, I believe all use is therapeutic use, but that's a conversation for a different webinar. So the point that I think we really need to hone in on here is that no matter where these guidelines come from, the field of psychedelics needs to move forward in a safe and ethical fashion if we're going to continue to grow, because this is something where a lot of big players have a lot of big stakes in keeping this stuff from getting accessible to the wide population of Canada that's suffering long wait times waiting for mental health services. So in order for us to allow for this field to grow above board, we need to make sure that we're doing ethical work underground, because that's what's going to shoot us in the foot. It's not going to be MAPS. It's not going to be, the ATMA Academy. It's not going to be anybody that's doing their work above board. Where we're going to get flack from and we're going to get scrutinized the most is from the work that's being done underground, because that's going to motivate this to be put farther and farther away from access. So we have to constantly engage in a process of ethical decision-making guided by existing codes of ethics. So we don't have one that's specific for us, but we have to look for where we can find that information and model ourselves after what exists already. So we have to take care and address ethical considerations working in the psychedelic realms and in psychedelic assisted therapy. So there's things that are different in psychedelic therapy than to normal therapy. So for like a normal therapeutic experience, you wouldn't need to build into your consent process working with somebody on how they want to go to the washroom, because generally in a 50-minute therapy session, that doesn't need to happen. But when you're looking at a 6 to 8 hour experience, there's most certainly going to be things that need to happen outside of the normal therapeutic intervention kind of lexicon. So we have to have a clearly defined documented process for ethical decision making. And that's where we contemplate the special considerations for extended spaces of consciousness. So this could actually also be applied to things like breath work. We don't need to be looking specifically to psychedelics, but in expanded states of consciousness in general, there are going to be special considerations that need to be made. So we look for the map, we look for what exists out there already that we can model ourselves after. So if we look to the Canadian Code of Ethics, it's got more key principles than the 4 that I'm listing here, but these are the 4 top ones, and they are in a hierarchy. So that means that the first one is first, the second one is second, and it follows that way down. So the first one is the respect for the dignity of persons and people. And for me, this ties into respecting somebody's right to choose what interventions they want for their medical health, for their mental health. This is something that requires you to respect a client's or a patient's autonomy to make decisions for themselves. And it ties into responsible caring. And what I feel is like really important to share here when we're talking about responsible caring in the scope of the psychedelic landscape and the emerging research, we're really seeing that this stuff works way better than anything that's out there right now, right? If you look at the research that's coming out, whether it's with PTSD, whether it's with smoking cessation, any of the research that's being done around this, you'll see that the data shows that this has a much higher efficacy rate than existing medications out there and existing treatment modalities. So I suggest, and it has been suggested to me, that to not hold space for these conversations, to not make way for psychedelics to come above board, that is irresponsible caring. So if you're in a clinical position and you're not willing to look at this new information and these new modalities that are coming out, can you really say that you're being a responsible caregiver? And then we look into this responsibility to society. So this is where kind of I have to step back a little bit on what I just said, because we can't look at psychedelics as a cure-all. We can't look at them as the band-aid that's going to fix the world. It really requires that we take a scientific approach and bring that data to light in a above board setting, because To just tell people that this is safe doesn't work for the vast majority of people. We have to prove that to them through the mechanisms that they know it to be provable through. And that's what's happening right now with the research. And then the last piece that I'll touch on in this slide is the integrity and relationship. So this is integrity in a relationship with yourself, with your providers, with your clients or participants if you have them, but really about walking your walk. So like the reason that we have ethical guidelines is because we know what decisions are going to be made in certain situations. So when an ethical dilemma comes up, the point of having this conversation is that we already know the action that we're going to take when that specific dilemma happens. And that is where integrity and relationship comes to head, is we need to not only have these discussions ahead of time, but also involve those decisions and those actions that may be taken in the consent process. And I'll expand on that a little bit more when we talk about informed consent, enhanced consent, and what happens when there are suppressed or repressed memories that come up and how that ties into a duty to warn. So we talk about a risk benefit analysis. So this is something that is done in clinical settings on a broad way right now. So you can look at somebody that works with patients that suffer from PTSD as a result of being in the military, and they're going to have a couple of tools in their belt that really work over the umbrella, that really work for all of the people that they see that are dealing with that specific issue. And that's not the case with psychedelics. So psychedelics, you cannot predict the experience. So it is not possible to say that this is going to work for all people in this type, regardless of the circumstances. It's why we need integration and preparation set up around these experiences, because to just take a psychedelic without any therapeutic input or output to it, it doesn't make it any different than just going to a rave and having fun, which again, I said, I believe all use is therapeutic use, but when we bring integration and preparation into the mix, what we do is maximize the therapeutic output of that experience. So this is tying into what I was saying about how this stuff works for certain things. We're finding the research say this stuff works for this problem when it's done right. And what that leads to is this question that we need to ask is like, are we actually being unethical right now in having this stuff be illegal? So I would love for you to consider that question as we go on. Does everything that is legal mean it's ethical? So we talk about risk benefit analysis. This is something that when I'm making the example of the person working with military people with PTSD, this is something where they do that risk benefit analysis on a broader sense. But when we're talking about psychedelic work, this really needs to be done on a case by case basis. So on a person by person basis, even on a journey by journey basis. These are questions that you can ask yourself if you're just doing this for your own care. But really it is like, why are you doing this? What is your motivation? What is your intention coming into this experience? And have you done an assessment of your current situation, right? Like your current mental health, your current surroundings, your current safety, to assess if this is actually something that's going to be beneficial for you in this moment. And that's something that needs to be done every single time. So we come to what we have to ask about in that risk benefit analysis. So we have to look at informed consent. So like the question is like, how do you get informed consent to an ineffable experience? If you aren't able to explain what's going to happen, can somebody truly consent to going into that? There's a school of thought that would say, because you can't actually get informed consent, we shouldn't be doing any of this work at all. It should be a full stop. So and I'm not saying those people are wrong. I'm not here to make anybody right or wrong. I'm just here to talk and ask the questions. So we have to look at how do we get informed consent in psychedelic spaces. And then we also have to look at how do you practice within scope. So we're talking about a novel intervention. So if we're talking specifically about psilocybin and what's happening right now, like this is a new above board treatment. And so there are not anywhere, there are no agencies, there are no places to go and get accreditation in this type of work. You can get training, but none of it is backed up by a college or a professional association. So this leads to the questions like, how do you achieve competence working as a psychedelic therapist? Like, how do you get the training and the experience and the supervision that you need in order to consider yourself competent if nowhere exists to get those things from? kind of leads you to a chicken or an egg question, right? Like what comes first, the competence or the places where you get the competence from. So just to be considered, right? Like how do you actually achieve competence in something that right now isn't really able to be done above board unless you're doing research or working with end of life patients. And then the other thing that's really important to talk about when we're talking in psychedelic spaces is transference and countertransference. So this means like, for instance, you could have a client who is assuming that you in the room are his father who had abused him and beat him. And so now he's coming at you to attack you. That's something that can happen in a psychedelic space. It's an enhanced version of transference. And the same thing can be said of countertransference. So for the provider, it's really important to be on your self-care, because just the same way that subconscious repressed and hidden memories can come up for the participant, what comes up for the participant can bring stuff up for the practitioner as well. So it's really important to be aware that that can happen in an enhanced way in a psychedelic setting. So it's kind of up to interpretation. This is from Dr. Megan McElheron. So she is the lovely woman that was my ethics instructor at Atma Academy. And she said, without clear guidelines and standards for competency, we're left to interpret the relevant standards and codes available to us. So without somebody out there, without an organization saying, here are the guidelines, we have to do our best to look at what's out there and then adapt that to our situation. It doesn't mean that you can't be competent just because there's no competency granting board. It just means that you need to prove it in another way, right? So there's kind of three areas that we can talk about ethics for the participant and for the presenter or for the practitioner, right? So it's before, during, and after. You've got before your journey, before you've taken a substance, before there's any medicine ingested. You've got during your journey, and then afterwards in the integration phase. And all three of those places can have different ethical applications to look at them. So when we're talking about the preparation ethics, you want to look at access, you want to look at other providers, and you want to look at safety. The big one here is safety. So it is ethical to check and make sure that your clients are physically and mentally capable of taking on this experience. There is some ethical obligation there for you to ask those questions. And sometimes that can involve other providers. So this may be something where you want to hear from their pharmacist that there isn't anything that's counterindicated for them. You may want to get a letter from their doctor saying that, you know, even though that these are mental health concerns they have, they should still be able to access this treatment from their medical opinion. And these are things that just really are about covering your butt. So all of this is just what I'm offering in a best case scenario. I'm not saying that every practitioner out there doing these things. I'm also not saying every practitioner out there should be doing these things. I'm just here asking these questions. So then we can talk about consent in preparation ethics. And we touched a little bit on how do you get consent for an experience that can't be consented to, because informed consent involves being informed about what's going to happen. And you can't necessarily provide that information when we're talking psychedelics. So you really need to go through the risk benefit analysis that we talked about with the participant. You want them to be there with you while you're having that kind of pros and cons conversation. And that brings you to a place where you are getting enhanced consent, and you can take a harm reduction approach. So you can come and meet this person where they are and then do the risk benefit analysis for them in that moment with their current situation for this specific journey that you're looking at taking. And then, you know, competence, yeah, chicken or egg. How do we do this? How do I become competent as a psychedelic therapist if there's nobody out there that can give me their stamp saying I am a psychedelic therapist, right? There are some trainings out there, but there's nothing that is gonna, I can pretty much guarantee you there is no certificate you're gonna get and be able to go to an insurance company and say, I want to open up a psychedelic therapy practice. It's not gonna happen. If it does, let me know, because I'd love to get the name of that insurance company. But you know, at the end of the day, this is where we are right now. Is that these associations, these groups of people that do get the power to make those decisions are coming together. They are forming, but they don't have anything to offer me yet. And so competence for me comes down to experience, training, and supervision, right? So have you been trained? Do you know what you're doing? Have you seen this done before? Supervision for me is so key, and we'll talk more about it later, but especially when we're talking about enhanced countertransference and transference. It's really important to have somebody to talk to about your clients and to have that be within the confines of professional confidentiality. And then the other thing that we can look at when we're talking about competence is collaboration. So there's no reason that I need to be the only person in the room when this happens. There's absolutely space for a doctor to be present, for a psychologist, for anybody that my participant wants present. If they're okay with it, that can be built into the competency, right? So it doesn't need to be one person taking on all of these ethical considerations. You can build yourself a team of people to cover all your bases. So I'm going to talk for a minute around enhanced consent. So this is like that idea that you can't get fully informed consent from somebody in a psychedelic experience because it's not able to be fully explained to them. So we have to approach that consent with a goal towards a higher enhanced process. And you have to include what any reasonable patient would want to know about a potential treatment. So the nature of the procedure itself, so like this is when, where, how, what can I expect, risks and potential benefits. I think this one is overlooked a little bit. I talk a lot about the potential benefits of psychedelics, and it's equally important that we have discussions about the potential risks. There's not much risk to your physical health if you've been cleared and screened properly, but there are definite risks to emotional health and emotional well-being, especially if integration and preparation haven't been given their due diligence. And then another thing that's really important to talk about is alternatives. So, you know, like, is this the first thing somebody's trying, or have they been through several things so far and found that not working, and that's where they're coming to you from? I'm not, again, not judging one way or the other. I think all use is therapeutic, but it is worth having the conversation from an ethical perspective to talk about what have you done so far, and what have you maybe not tried that you could try before this. They're important conversations to have. So the person needs to understand what they're consenting to, most of which is unknown, right? You can have an idea that this is going to last 6 to 8 hours. You can have an idea that, you know, you're going to feel it come on at a certain time. But beyond that, it's really kind of up to set and setting to determine what comes out of a journey and where that person is at in their mindset at that point in time. Because this could shift the way that they look at the world, look at themselves, look at other people. Like, this is something that is potentially life altering. You know, you could do a journey with somebody and then have them decide out of that journey that they need to divorce their partner. And 3 months later, they're blaming you because they made that decision. You know, these are real world issues. This is stuff that happens. So, you know, you have to really orient people to an understanding that this could shift their personhood. This could shift their sense of self. You have to allow them to say yes to taking that potential risk on. You have to orient them to potential mental health risks during the active phase. So the increased anxiety, different memories of traumatic experiences, perhaps completely unexperienced trauma can come up. This is stuff that you need to let people know ahead of time if you want to be in an ethical posture. You have to have those conversations. And we can talk about ethics during the journey. So we can talk about consent. There's therapeutic touch and the approach to an unpredictable experience. So touch for me is something that I am not personally, I have not received any therapeutic training in how to offer therapeutic touch. So for me, therapeutic touch in session is very limited, but there are people that are trained in somatic experiencing, Reiki, there's a ton of other modalities that if you're trained in and you are competent in, then it does make sense to offer them in a therapeutic way during a journey. But all that has to be built into that consent process. So when you're talking about consent and therapeutic touch, you're going to check ahead of time. When you're screening, you're going to talk about how this person would like to be touched. I would even suggest you go as far as to demonstrate that. So do you want to be touched on the back of the hand? Is there a word you want to use that lets me know that this is a touch that's useful for you in this moment? Is there maybe even a hand gesture that we want to set up ahead of time to tell me to stop therapeutic touch? And always, 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 consent is gained. So during the screening process, you're going to talk about therapeutic touch. Session day, journey day, you're going to talk about therapeutic touch and consent. And then prior to, while the journey is going, you are also going to get consent before you offer therapeutic touch. So always, 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 when we're talking about physical contact, we're talking about consent in every capacity and in all three phases of the journey. So we can talk about, handling unintended disclosures, So for me, at least, I know if I have a perception that there is ongoing abuse or potential immediate risk of harm or loss of life for somebody or a child or an elderly person, I'm a mandated reporter. So that has to be very clearly outlined in my consent process, very clearly, because we don't know what's going to come up during journeys, right? And I have to have that permission from them to know that they are being held to my ethical codes, just the same as I am. And they have to be willing to accept that risk and move forward with the journey. It's really important to talk about that ahead of time. And then we can talk about safety. So containing intense emotion, like how are we going to regulate if we're in session and you are getting completely flooded? What are options for you to get you to help you regulate or perhaps co-regulate? This can include therapeutic touch. This can include breath work. This can include tapping. There's so many different ways that this can look, but it's important to talk about those regulating factors before you're in the fire, right? Make these decisions before the dilemma comes up. We also talk about co-facilitation. So best practice, in my opinion, is one male, one female, or a blend of those. If you have somebody that's on the gender spectrum, that's great too. That might even in some cases be necessary. So the reason that we do co-facilitation is so that there's somebody else in the room, so that if a strong sense of transference comes on and I'm getting beat because this person thinks that I am his father, there's somebody else there that can step in and be the facilitator for the rest of that journey. It's really important, not just safety wise for your participants, but for you as well as a practitioner. Is this always possible? No. Does this make it less affordable? Absolutely. But I'm just here talking best practices and asking questions. So if it's a possibility to have somebody co-facilitate with you, I encourage you to look at that option. And then you also really need to be mindful of suggestibility. So people in altered states are suggestible. They are open to you planting seeds for them that may or may not sprout somewhere down the line. And what you really want to avoid and be mindful of with suggestibility is that you never want your participant to feel that they are being coerced, especially in a psychedelic state, because that can bring on an intense panic. So mindfulness around suggestibility is just a really important thing to consider when you're looking at safety. And really, I would also say is maybe a reason why you should be meeting with your clients at least 2 times before a journey, because they need to be able to understand that you are not coercing them in any way. So you need to give time for that to at least land on a subconscious level for them, because that's what we're working with when we get into session. And then we can talk about integration ethics. So again, we talk about confidentiality, consent, and competence. So we have to have respect for an individual to maintain sanctity around their psychedelic experience. So what does this mean? This means that I'm not going to interpret somebody's experience for them, okay? It's not my job to tell them what it means. It is their job to share with me, if they choose to, and only if they choose to, what's come up for them. Because we're talking about things that can come up from the subconscious or from a repressed trauma memory space, just because something came up doesn't mean they want to process it, right? So again, when we talk about safety, we talk about consent, we talk about you have to respect a person's right to choose their own healing journey. We have to respect their internal healing mechanisms. And if for them that means that they don't want to talk about what happened, then that's something that needs to be respected. We can look at consent. So discussing and accommodating information that emerged during the active state. Yeah, this is it, right? Like, do we want to talk about that? If it's a no, it's a no, and that's okay. That's actually really good. If somebody's able to give you a no, that means that they're giving themselves a yes. So it's really important to respect that. And then we can talk about competence. So the reason I bring competence into integration ethics is because there's a difference, for me at least. I find a difference in the idea of sitting for somebody, which is to make sure that their body is physically safe during an experience, versus working in a therapeutic healing modality. And to me, that's what integration looks like from a professional perspective. So you need to have a little bit of training on how to do integration. You need to be aware of what your limitations are. Like if something comes up that does want to be processed and you're not qualified to process it, you should be open to referring that person out, or at least being able to connect them to resources so that if they chose to take that on, they'd have somebody appropriate to do that with. So it really requires being aware of your scope of competence, what you are willing to do, what you aren't willing to do. And again, having that built right in from the very beginning in your consent and screening process. You know, this is what I'm here for. And anything that's outside of that, I'm probably not the best person to help you do it, but I will help you find the best person to help you do it. Aha. Did anybody get the moon? No. Yeah. So the reason that I put this in is because when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about how different people view the same thing. Okay. We're talking about perspectives. We're talking about assumptions. So I just wanted to put this in here to give a moment to think about, maybe you made some assumptions on this photo. Yeah. So where else are you making assumptions is the question, right? And it's not to be like, haha, I got you. But, you know, really there is something to consider here, right? Like what are we perceiving, and is that reality? What do we perceive to be ethical, and is that reality, right? We're going to jump into, maybe Peter, you can let me know. I just want to double check how much time I have.
You're good.
Good. So we got confidentiality ethics, referral ethics, relational ethics, and financial ethics. So these are what I call the four pillars of ethical practice or ethical posture. If you are a participant, if you are a practitioner, if you are anybody in the psychedelic space and you are going to be doing work underground, I really recommend that you cement and nail down these four areas for yourself. If you're working above ground, there's a really good chance that you're working with somebody that already has an existing code of ethics. And if you have these four things nailed down, you will be in alignment with that. I pretty much guarantee you. But from an underground perspective or from a participant perspective, so if you're somebody that's engaging in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy and you're not using a Section 56 or a special access program, that means you're underground, okay? Unless you're in a ketamine clinic or a research trial. So even as a participant, even as somebody who uses psychedelic substances therapeutically, this is a really good thing to nail down for yourself because they come up in different ways, in different settings, but they're really about having your own personal sense of a moral, ethical compass, like your ethical true north. And the reason, again, is because it makes it really simple to make your decisions ahead of time. So I'm going to talk about the four different pillars. It's confidentiality, referral, financial, and the last one is the longest one. It's interrelational. So how do we relate to people? When we're talking about confidentiality, we're talking privacy. We're talking like, are we at a professional standard? What level of confidentiality are you guaranteeing? And this can be really important for me as the practitioner. It's also really important for the participants because I need to know that I'm not going to get arrested next week because we have gone on a journey together. That makes me feel safe. So when we're talking about privacy, we're not just talking about privacy for the participants and the information that's shared. We're talking about confidentiality. We're talking about, can I trust you to tell you that I do this work? Can you trust me to tell me you are seeking this help? And that's all about confidentiality. And it really needs to be brought up, the idea of informed consent. So informed consent, we talked about a little bit, but like you have to disclose any obligations that you have to release information as a mandated reporter or to address safety issues. Like you have to let people know, these are the things that I'm required legally to take outside of this relationship. When we're talking about ethics and ethical decision-making and addressing ethical conflicts, generally speaking, that's policed from within the relationship. The only time that it ends up going outside of that relationship is when we've hit a legal barrier. So when there is a reason for me to be a mandated reporter and have to take that information outside the relationship, it's really important to discuss that in the informed consent process. I would also suggest it's really important to talk about how do you want to talk to each other? Are you okay with receiving text messages about psychedelics? Is that a red flag for you? If I'm sending you an email and I haven't got consent to do that, is your computer accessible to other people? I don't want to make the assumption, right, that you're okay to receive an email from me talking about what we're doing. I have to get consent for that. And then you also want to look at like, where are the records being stored? How are they being stored? For me, it's all online. There are apps that therapists can use that have great integrated security protocols. But just in general, right? Like, how is the information being stored, if it's even being stored? Some practitioners may not even have written records or online records. So yeah. And then we can move to referral ethics. So referral ethics, this is where we're talking about like what I don't know, right? Like, so for me, I can assure you that at this point in time, I'm not trained in handling childhood sexual abuse. I'm not trained in how to heal that. I'm not trained in how to access it safely. It's just not something I am competent in yet. Is there training for it? Yes. Can I get experience with it? Yes. Can I become competent to it? Yeah. But until that's something that I'm prepared to hold space for from an ethical posture, until I'm able to say I can work with that and pretty much guarantee I'm not going to harm you in the process, then that's somewhere that I refer out. And this can be taken beyond that kind of example, right? Like, this can be, are you competent with ayahuasca, or are you only competent using psilocybin? Right? Different psychedelics have different mechanisms, and they can evoke different things. So like, competence can be split up into a whole bunch of different areas. And yeah, what's really important is that you're representing your work and your qualifications honestly. So like, this is me, this is the training I have, this is the experience I have in supervision, and this is what I'm offering now as a result of having the competence to do so. You also need to take into account, like, are you actually able to help this person, right? Like, can what this person needs be addressed with the modalities you offer? Because, if somebody's coming to, this is going to be a really weird example, but if somebody needs help with an ingrown toenail and they're coming to you to use psychedelics, that might be a time to refer out. That's a really weird example, but it's the same concept that applies, right? Like, if somebody's coming to me for something that is better addressed by somebody else, I'm going to refer you. I'm going to be able to say during my screening process, hey, it's not lining up. Like, what you're looking to get out of this isn't something that I can offer, but I'm aware of these other options for you that could be better. And I'd be more comfortable if you went and talked to them first. That's an ethical decision to make. What we'll talk about when we get into financial ethics is operating only from a place of abundance. Like, I'm not going to take your money if I have nothing to offer you. If I don't think what I do is going to benefit you, then we're going to talk about that, right? So another thing you want to talk about in referral ethics is like your maintenance of your certifications and licenses. So if you are above board and you are accredited and you do have like an ethical association that's backing you, it's really important to maintain your licenses and certifications with them, just as a side note. And then we look at financial ethics. So like, when I think about financial ethics, it's all about money. It's about, how much does this cost? It's about the rationale for that. Is this person willing to explain to you why it costs that much? Because if they're not, that's a red flag for me. If you're not willing to be open and transparent about your financials, especially in the underground, that's a concern for me, right? I want to know, like, why is it $3,000 for 6 hours of your time? Because if you can justify that, and there are people who can justify that and are absolutely worth every penny, awesome. But if they are not willing to give you the rationale behind that number, it doesn't leave you feeling very secure and safe. Transparency is so huge in building safety and building rapport and building a therapeutic alliance. And one of the biggest places that people don't like to talk about is their money. So like, from an ethical perspective, for me, these conversations, everything that we're talking about, this is built into my screening process. All of this stuff comes up. But that's not the case for everybody. So as a participant, you have the ability to ask these questions, right? Like, why does it cost this much? I just would like to know, like, what's the reasoning behind that? I mean, maybe it's the other way. Maybe somebody's offering something that could be considered $1,000 experience for $30. I don't know. They could be a perfectly competent provider. I don't know. If you ask them, what's the rationale behind that? If they have a good answer, then maybe it's just a great deal. Maybe they're trying to get experience. But where red flags go up for me is when that conversation isn't offered, right? If I ask a question about transparency and financials, and that really puts you into a defensive position, that makes me feel unsafe in a relationship with you. It makes me feel like you're hiding something. So it's really important to have those conversations, all of them, right out at the front. I think all of this should be included in the screening process. And another thing I would say is it's really important that you confirm cost before providing treatment. So you want to be absolutely clearly understood. This is what I'm offering. This is the price for what I'm offering. This is when I expect you to pay me for what I'm offering. All those conversations are really important to be had up front, because it never is okay to coerce somebody into paying you money afterwards. If you haven't been clear with them up front about what the costs are, that's yellow flags for me. So yeah, really important. Disclose that information before you've initiated treatment. You don't want to initiate or continue treatment just for financial gain. So this is a big one for me. If you are only providing service because you need their money, that is not ethical. Okay. Not to say that you don't deserve to get paid for your time and that you can't earn a living, but if the only reason that you're offering this person a treatment is because you need their money, that is not ethical. Now, if you're offering this treatment to somebody because you need their money and they could really benefit from your services, then that's just a match made in heaven. But it's really important in assessment, in screening, to have that consideration, to look at, like, is actually what I do going to benefit you? Because if it's not, and you're still taking this person's money, then you're not in ethical alignment. Yeah. Oh, and another thing here with money is I don't accept any donation, gift, certificate, food basket, whatever. If somebody refers somebody to me, I do not compensate them for that referral. That's built out of my ethical practice. So that's just a personal decision I've made. I know people that have a different opinion. I'm not saying either is right or wrong. I'm just here asking. And then the last place that we'll touch on today is the relational ethics. And this is like pretty much the biggest piece of ethics. I've gone through 3 pages of notes for everything so far. I've got 11 pages of notes just on relations. So everything comes into relational ethics. This is how we relate to ourselves. This is how we relate to others. This is how we relate to the psychedelics. This is how we relate to spirit or to God or to source. There's so many different things to consider when you're talking about relationship in ethics. So the first thing I will share is that always, always, always you should be including your participants in the decisions you're making about their process. So if you're talking about dosage, if you're talking about set setting, if you're talking about any piece of their treatment plan, they should be included in that treatment plan consideration. You have to honor a participant's ability, their right to say no to something. And if they're not being brought in on the decision-making process, you're not giving them the chance to say no, right? You're making decisions for them when there could be other options on the table if they had been present. So again, all these conversations happen before you initiate treatment. Yeah. You try to give them an accurate description of the medication that you're using. You try to give them the potential risks and benefits, which we talked about, and you try to give them alternative treatment options if there are any available. That all plays into how you're relating to that person at the beginning of the relationship. And we talk about, when we get into relational ethics, therapeutic alliance. So therapeutic alliance is this concept where there isn't actually an expert in the room. So therapeutic alliance means that me and you are working in collaboration, right? I'm not here to be telling you how to heal. I am here to work in conjunction with you so that we can facilitate a healing process. That's kind of the idea behind therapeutic alliance and trust. So it's about respecting the inner healing intelligence of your participants and allowing them to guide their own experiences. You have to respect their autonomy. So it is their choice what decisions they make in their life, and it's also their choice what meaning they make of those experiences. So healing is really personal, right? Like everybody's healing journey is different. Everybody's healing journey is completely individual to them. So it is incumbent upon us as the practitioners, right, to respect that inner healing intelligence and to make sure that it's supported, because at the end of the day, they're the person that are going home with whatever's been uncovered, right? They're the ones that have to be able to handle that in the other 155 hours in the week than the one that you sat with them, right? So it's really about allowing them to find their own inner healing intelligence and then supporting them to be able to trust that and to follow it. Really important to talk about that power differential. So like that perception that exists even in a unconscious way of I am the expert, you are the participant, I am the doctor, you are the patient. That type of power dynamic where somebody's up here and somebody's down here really should get addressed in conversation. You need to be really aware of how that power differential can be perceived. So if we think about, was that a picture of the moon or the sun? You may you may see the sun, but your participant may see the moon. So having that conversation really is just about bringing everybody onto the same page so that we're looking at the same thing and meeting each other as equals. Yeah, also, I guess when you're, something to mention here is when you're working with more than one person at a time. So if you're working in groups, you're working with couples sometimes, maybe you're working with families, you want to consider potential conflicts of interests. You want to consider how you're going to handle information that's shared with you from one person being shared with the rest of the people in that experience. These are things that you really want to take into consideration ahead of time if you're working with couples or families specifically. Relational ethics also talks about touch. So there's two types of touch in ethics. There's okay touch and there's not okay touch, right? We've got therapeutic touch and we've got untherapeutic or sexual touch. So there are two different topics. I'll address both of them a little separately, but they are really the same kind of area around consent, around respect and trust and autonomy. Right? We only offer techniques such as touch if they're within our scope of practice and competence, right? I'm not going to offer my participants a massage. I'm not a massage therapist. That will never happen in one of my sessions. Has it happened in other people's? Probably. Is it ethical? Depends on who's offering the touch. If you have somebody who is a trained professional in a touch modality, there's no reason they can't be involved in that person's healing journey if that's what the person wants. Right? It's all about consent, and it's really about only bringing something to the table that you are capable and qualified of offering. So we talked about consent and touch. So we always get consent. We're going to talk about it in our preparation and our screening. We're going to talk about consent for touch. When we are doing the medicine journey day, before we take the medicine, we're going to talk again about consent and touch. And in our journey, we're also going to talk, if there's any point in time where I feel therapeutic touch might be useful for you, we're going to talk about consent. And then we can talk about therapeutic touch. Yeah, there is the other type of touch, which is sexual touch, right? Sexual boundaries. So like the question is like, what do ethics say about about sexual boundaries with your clients? You know, there's multiple schools of thought here. For me, it's like, I know for me, sexual healing isn't a modality I am fluent in. I'm not saying there are people that need sexual healing, that need healing to do with their sexual energies. And I believe they should have the right to access that healing. I just also know that it's not within my scope of practice. This is not something I'm trained in, not something I'm qualified in, not something I have experience in. It's probably not something I'm going to look to get competent in either. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who are qualified, competent out there. And that's a decision for them to make on a case-by-case basis. All of this is case by case. For me, I know that I take responsibility for upholding clear professional boundaries. That is my job. Okay. When we're looking at psychedelics and we're looking at expanded states of consciousness, we're looking at suggestibility, right? Your participant may not be able to uphold sexual boundaries for themselves. And that becomes my job, right? I am the professional in the room. It is my onus, my responsibility to uphold those clear professional boundaries. And that means I do not engage in sexual touch with participants. It also means I don't engage with sexual touch with my participants partners, with my participants' family, with their friends. Anybody that I've met that's in the world of this participant is off limits for sexual touch for me. It is out of bounds. It is unethical to have any type of sexual encounter with anybody that's involved in your client's life. Okay. That's my perspective. Unless this is something that's being specifically consented to and you have the capacity to offer that healing modality, sexual touch does not belong in therapy. Okay. The thing that we need to add there, though, is that, like I said, you can't control what's coming up for your clients. So there may be sexual energy in the room. And a really important thing to consider ahead of time is how you're going to handle that, right? Like what are you going to do? How are you going to respect your participants' sexual identities, their expression of sexual energy? How are you going to validate their processes that might relate to sexuality and sexual healing? These are all things that you can do and you should do that don't involve sexual touch, but they do involve sexual energy. And so there are considerations to be made around how are you going to support a client who needs to heal when sexual energy comes from their experience. Right? Like what are you going to be able to offer in that moment? Yeah. And then we look into diversity. So diversity is really about like, how are we going to make this available for everybody, right? We're talking about sliding scales. We're talking about making sure that we have a BIPOC representation in our population of participants. There's so many ways that diversity can come into expanded states of consciousness work, especially because of transference. Okay. So again, this ties back to why it's really, really a great idea to have a co-facilitator of an opposite sex in the room, because if you are working with somebody and something comes up for them that's related to gender, you have somebody else in the room to swap that out to. It could be the same for if you have somebody that has something come up in relation to, say, racial trauma that they've experienced, right? Maybe me, cis white man Doug, isn't the best person to be in that room for that psychedelic experience. If that's a type of trauma that might need to be addressed during this, am I really the best person to be in the room for that? It really takes a lot of consideration, and again, that consent process of discussing and screening, so important to screen and find out what is going on for this person, and am I the best person to offer this help, right? Or is this maybe an opportunity for a referral? And there are other considerations with diversity, like you want to provide culturally informed care, right? So there might be some type of therapeutic touch that's totally above, like totally normal in a Western setting, but when you're working with somebody that's from a different country, things that are normal for us could be completely unacceptable to them. So you want to really be alive to those issues and to bring them up in conversation, because where we build that safety, where we build that therapeutic alliance, we build it in conversation, we build it in relationship. And then there's special considerations in expanded states of consciousness. So this is where it's really important not to engage in coercive behaviors. It's like we have to understand that participants are especially open to suggestion, manipulation, and exploitation. So you have to have an increased sense of safety and an increased sense of consent involved to mitigate that. Right? We don't engage in coercive practices or behaviors. And it's really important to consider like what our behavior is that could be, like the moon and the sun, perceived differently, right? Like what may be potentially coercive behavior to me. Like it may seem something totally normal, like asking, hey, do you want to go to the washroom? To your client in a psychedelic state, that could be a really charged, activating question. So you really have to let them take the lead and allow that to be like the guiding principle for your experience, is that the participant's internal healer is the best intelligence in the room, right? And we talked about unconscious material already, so I won't bring that up again. We talked about beliefs. Yeah. So like when we're talking about cultural sensitivity, we have to have respect, curiosity, and openness towards our own beliefs. So it's not my job to help the client understand my perception of their experience. through my lens of beliefs, right? Um, you have to cultivate an expanded perspective that embraces extraordinary states or extraordinary states. Like you have to work to provide yourself with the capacity to hold space for people from different cultures. Um, we can look into professional relationships and relationships in professional settings. So it's like, for me, this is like really about consultation and supervision. When I'm talking about professional relationships, I talk about consultation supervision. So I work with a supervisor. I pay my money to have this person sit with me and go through my caseload. They are bound by the same legal requirements of confidentiality that I am bound by. And that is something, again, again, I will say, should be brought up in your screening process. It should be brought up in your journey process. It should be brought up in your integration work. My clients anyway sign off on a document where they're acknowledging that I seek supervision for this work. So they are signing off on giving me permission to speak about what's going on with them and what's going on for me when I'm holding space for them in a setting outside of our relationship. And I have to get consent to do that. I also, when it comes to working in with professionals and with colleagues, I need feedback, right? It's part of my process. Like I want your feedback. I want to know what I'm doing well. I want to know what you're perceiving that has room for improvement. It also involves offering feedback when I see that there's some benefit for my opinion to be shared. It also means like when you have an ethical concern, who do you talk to about it? For me, this is supervision. I have somebody that is specifically there for that purpose, but some people don't have that. So who do you talk about it with, right? Are you in touch with a professional accountability group, perhaps, where 2 or 3 or up to 20 even people are getting together and talking about their ethics and about their casework together? There is a peer supervision model that you can adopt. But again, you have to make it really clear in your consent process that that's the model that you're adopting. Yeah, and the last place I guess I want to touch on is the relationship that you have with yourself. So because transference and countertransference are so exceptional when we're working with psychedelics, it's really important that we commit to an ongoing practice of self-compassion and self-inquiry. We want to seek professional assistance and community support for our own emotional challenges or personal conflicts. And here's the meaty part, especially when, in my view or in someone else's view, it's affecting my capacity to provide ethical care. Okay. So if I have just lost my dog, okay, and that is impairing my ability to provide service, and we've got a retreat planned this weekend, hopefully I'm going to be, if I'm really affected by it, to the point where I know I'm not going to be able to provide effective care, I'm going to step away from that engagement. I'd probably try to find somebody to take over that engagement if that was something that my participants were willing to consent to. And if that wasn't possible, then we'd have to reschedule. If you are not in a position to be delivering care and you're not aware of that, I really encourage you to surround yourself with people who are willing to let you know that, right? If you have people in your life that are willing to say, hey, Douglas, you're not doing well right now. You're not okay. You just lashed out at the cafeteria lady. That's not like you. Maybe there's something that we need to look at working on here because you're holding space for other, right? And when transference and countertransference come into play in an exaggerated way, it can be really hard to know what is right and what is wrong in those moments if you are not resourced yourself to a center of your ethical true north, your ethical compass. So the last thing I really want to mention is this idea of humility. So I approach every engagement with my clients with humility. I really believe that people's internal healing intelligence is the smartest thing in the room. There's nothing that I'm going to be able to offer that's going to be better than what that internal healing intelligence has to offer. So I subscribe to the value of humility, right? I subscribe that out of respect for the transformative power of the experience I have the privilege to witness, and out of respect for human dignity, that I don't know everything, that there is a certain level where my knowledge ends, right? There are certain things that I'm not the best person to help you deal with. And for me to be in an ethical posture, I need to know where my strengths are. And I also need to be fully aware of where my strengths are not. Because where my strengths are not are places that I can resource, or there are places that I can build a team around. There are places that I can build a referral list for, right? If I'm aware of what I don't know, then I can find people who know it, because those are the people that are going to be best set to offer that help to others. So that's kind of the end of my spiel here. Yeah, I think Peter's probably going to pop us into some Q&A, but I just wanted to give you a moment to enjoy this beautiful sunset at Thunder Lake Provincial Park in Alberta. And I really thank you all for taking the time to listen to this webinar. Ethics are my favorite conversation in psychedelic spaces. So yeah, it really is an honor for me to be able to be here and to be speaking with all of you. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Douglas. So we are going to open it up to Q&A. We've got about 30 minutes before the close of the meeting, so we can take up as much or as little time as we need to. And I'd like to kick it off with a question that I have. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to get a sense from you, what is the difference then between these different types of consents? We've got enhanced, informed, and then ongoing consent, all of which can be problematic when you're in an enhanced state experience.
Totally, yeah. So I guess I would kind of think of it like an upside down pyramid. So consent's at the bottom, right? And then there's informed consent, and then there's enhanced consent. So I would consider enhanced consent to include informed consent and basic consent. And when we're talking enhanced consent, it's bringing our attention to, bringing to life these potential considerations we need to make. And really to continue hitting on that throughout your experience with this client, because you want to be building that rapport, that relationship with them right from the very minute that they contact you. So when we're talking about enhanced consent, we really are going through this process of explaining very clearly that I can't get from you informed consent because I can't explain for you what's going to happen, right? And then below that, there's informed consent. Informed consent is where I can explain to you exactly what you can expect, and you can say yes to that. And then below that, and also in informed consent, I also include confidentiality, right? Like I'm a mandated reporter. These are the situations that if something comes up, I am required by law to step outside of our relationship and address that. That's informed consent. And then consent below that would be like, hey, do you want a high five? No? Okay, no consent. That's kind of how I guess I would conceptualize that answer. I hope that was helpful.
It does help. Thank you. So I'd open it up to the floor for any of you that have questions. Feel free to jump in. I have a ton. I could ask questions for an hour. So while you guys are thinking of your stuff, I'll ask one more. As we mentioned right off the top, that when underground work is being done, there is no regulatory body, there is no professional association, there is an absence of an existing external structure to lean on. What, to your knowledge, has been done in terms of creating codes of ethics for underground practitioners that could even be the start of developing something that could be a personal code of ethics or an underground association group code of ethics? Is there something existing that can be drawn from?
Totally. Yeah. Great question. There is, am I unmuted? Yeah. There is something called the North Star Pledge. So it's ethical commitment that practitioners can make. It's a community-based code. It's not even something that I would fully qualify as a code, but it's more of a set of ethical commitments that you can hold yourself to. So that's out there. There is a specific ethical document put out by MAPS, but it's specific to ketamine assisted therapeutics. So you could look for that, or I could provide resource to that. As far as an actual organization that's stepping up and saying, hey, all practitioners, this is the call of ethics. This is the Horn of Gondor calling you to come and be ethical with us. No, I'm not aware of that association. I know that the Canadian Psychedelic Association is working very hard in Ottawa to move the needle on how these things are being considered illegal versus legal. And I think as you see things become more available to a wider population, you're going to see these ethical organizations come out. And again, if you're looking for safety in underground practice, I really encourage you to develop a code of ethics for yourself, because if you are doing ethical work, you are covering your booty, right? CYA is the game of ethics. You are not only saying to people like, this is what you can expect from me, but you also have documentation, right? You also have a completely documented process saying, I have done all of this, so that at the end of the day, if you do have a complaint put against you, you can pull that out and you can say, yes, but here was the rationale. I went through all the different alternative options for this person. We decided as a team that this was the best one. So we went and we did a risk benefit analysis. Here it is. I went through all the different things that could go wrong and all the different things that could go right. And on this 1 out of 1,000 case, yes, something went wrong, but I did everything I could ethically along the way to make sure that this was a safe experience for this person.
Thank you.
Hey, Douglas, I don't really have a question. I just have more of a comment, I guess, or whatever. But myself, I very rarely ever sit with people, but this has been very informative for me because I have a lot of people that come and talk to me about this, and it's really great to hear all of this and be able to pass some information on to people when I talk to them about going forward and doing a journey. Yeah, thank you very much for all the information.
Really appreciate that feedback. Yeah, and it's like even in like non-clinical and non-professional relationships, like ethics are still really important. I would suggest, maybe you're not sitting or guiding, but feeling comfortable and having those conversations is really rare. So I would hope that this has given you some sort of safe place to have that conversation from when they do come up. Yeah.
Well, I definitely feel, like if this had been in place for me many years ago, I would have, be a different. I mean, I'm great. I'm really grateful for where I am, but would have been really, something I didn't think about at the time, right? And then, so it's nice now we can go forward and educate.
Yeah, and even in those low-key settings, even if you're just enjoying psychedelics with friends, it's really a great idea to talk about these ethical considerations ahead of time, because what happens in those experiences can affect your friendships, right? So why not build a little bit of safety into it? Absolutely.
Yeah, I just have one question. I've had a couple of experiences lately, like tripping virtually with someone and sharing that space of consciousness. And I see the value of being witnessed and everything in that space of consciousness. And I'm considering eventually down the line starting a career as some kind of a psychedelic integration. But what would be the first steps in just sitting for someone and finding people to just sit and hold that space for someone on not a non-professional level, more just being there as a support and a sitter? What would be the first steps in doing that?
Yeah, so if you're just looking at being a sitter, and so for me, this is where I'll make a differentiation between a guide and a sitter. So for me, sitter is keeping you physically safe. A guide is somebody that's active in the therapeutic process while you're on the journey. So those are two different competencies for me. So as far as sitting goes, the questions I would ask were have you used psychedelics before?
Yeah, I have over 2 or 3 years worth of experience with psilocybin.
Right. So you have the experience of going through those yourself. So you are aware of what can come up, of what needs might need to be met for somebody on a physical level in those situations. And I guess really to answer that, what I'd say is if you're a person that uses psychedelics, if you've had a good experience or a bad experience, it means you've had experience, right? When we're talking about physical safety of someone, anything is better than nothing. So anything is more ethical than nothing, right? Whether you're facilitating this on Zoom or in person, just your presence is the biggest piece of the puzzle when you're talking about sitting for someone. And so are there specific learnings that you could go for, yeah, I'm sure you could find some, are there any that I would consider that are necessary? Not at this point in time, and that may shift, but I would suggest from my perspective, being willing to sit with somebody is a gift in itself. And so it doesn't take a lot to offer presence. It doesn't take a lot of training to offer your presence, right? I hope that wasn't insanely vague.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I just want to know that like I could offer that to someone because I have that kind of experience.
Totally.
Because
Yeah,
I've had experiences like where I tripped virtually with someone and it was just life-changing for me. So
totally.
and I see the value of just being witnessed in that space of consciousness and holding space for someone.
Yeah, the witness, like to be witnessed. So there are two schools of thought. There's people that say if you're doing this in a group setting and you don't have a group of doctors, it's a waste of medicine. I don't believe that. I've seen really powerful therapeutic outcomes come from doing group work. And without a doctor present, without a therapist present. All my therapeutic value up until this point from psychedelics has been from recreational use. And I have had immense therapeutic value from that recreational use. So yeah, that's kind of my answer to that. It's like, you don't need to be an expert. You don't need to be a doctor. You need to be a human being that's capable of holding space for another. And then you can layer stuff on top of that. But that initial piece is the most important one.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Something I'd add to that as well from my own experience is some of the best people that I know of that work as sitters, not necessarily guides as much, but sitters, are midwives and doulas or teachers, people that are used to doing a lot of sitting and holding space with people in different circumstances, but they end up not being all that dissimilar from an expanded state of consciousness, or the same skill set is called upon. So Douglas, I'm curious from you, based on your understanding of people that have other kinds of training, are there forms of training that are better suited to leaning into this work than others?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Yeah, I think the real answer I have for you is that, like, be good at something, right? Like, it isn't necessary for you to be good at everything. If you want to be a therapist, be a great therapist, but also find yourself a pharmacist to talk to, find yourself a psychologist to talk to, find yourself a psychiatrist to talk to, so that you're not alone holding that space, right? As far as specific modalities, I would suggest from what I'm learning right now, that somatic experiencing therapy is really beneficial, really similar to the process of integration around psychedelics that I've learned. There's a lot of crossover. That being said, I mean, you can go and get trained and certified in somatic processing on Udemy for $200 and get a certificate. Now, does that mean you're competent? Don't know. There's other programs that you can pay a lot of money and you have to spend 3 years learning how to do that work. Does that make you more competent than a 6-month program? I don't know. So, it's like, there are things that lend themselves well to psychedelics, but it's like, pick one thing and be good at, and then layer things on top of that. Like, you don't have to have all your bases covered. If you want to be a businessman, and then build a team around you that does the other things. If you want to be the pharmacist, be the pharmacist. If you want to be the chemist that designs the drugs, be the chemist that designs the drugs, right? But pick what you want to do and be good at that, and then figure out where are your strengths, where are they not, and then find people that cover those strengths for you.
All right, so seeing no more questions, I think we'll wrap it there. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us tonight and to give this presentation. I think it's really, really valuable to not just start this discussion, but to keep it ongoing. And so I'd invite anybody who's watching this recording to join us over at the Heart Hub to continue this and other relevant discussions about the impact and potential impact of working with psychedelics. And any expanded state of consciousness that may or may not involve medicines or drugs. And what are the ethical considerations that we as participants from any perspective need to take into account before we get into that work. So thank you everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time.